Okay, Mary, this first question's for you, but anybody can answer it. It was stated today that being transgender is not compatible with the Catholic faith. There is, quote, no compromise with those who support trans persons. Is there room in the church for trans persons? And should trans persons be denied communion and other sacraments?
Okay, that's a lot. So first of all, just to correct the framing of the question, it's not true that can you repeat that, the first line? Trans people are, what was the phrasing of that?
Being transgender is not compatible with the Catholic faith.
So let me clarify. It's not being transgender. First of all, the church says no one, quote, is transgender as if it's a different kind of person. What the church says is that the ideology behind this is incompatible with Christian ideology. It's not pronouncing a judgment on any individual person. So any person is welcome. If you're a Catholic, you're welcome in the church. Now, like any other Catholic, your ability to participate in the sacraments, to be a witness at a baptism or a godparent or a lector, all of those things, you still have to meet conditions which apply to everyone. And I'll give you an example. The CDF, Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith, answered a question that was posed by a bishop about whether someone who had undergone a transition, in other words, they were representing themselves not as their sex, but as the opposite sex, whether that person could be a godparent. And the answer was no. And it wasn't a pronouncement on their moral character. It didn't say anything about that at all. It said that the particular office, if you will, or responsibility of being a godparent means that you are shepherding this person in faith. A person who has embraced a transgender identity and is continuing to represent themselves as that, the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith said it reveals, and I've got the exact quote, but it reveals an incompleteness in understanding the church's teaching on the person. In other words, they were not in a position to either witness to the faith as godparent, but also there was something lacking in their own preparation. So it's not a moral judgment. I think we have to be careful about that. So someone's ability to receive communion, for example, depends on whether they're in the state of grace, which means you have to go to confession, seek forgiveness for your mortal sins. You have to fast before communion. All of those things apply to everyone. I've known situations where someone has undergone a medical transition. Then they, in most cases, the two I'm thinking of, came back to the faith, really loved God for a variety of reasons. Their own medical situation was such that they could not sort of retransition by going through additional surgeries and things. Much like how the church treats someone who has been sterilized, the church doesn't mandate that you get your sterilization reversed. You have to repent of doing actions that are incompatible with living your faith. In other words, if you've repudiated the gift that God gave you as your sexual identity, it's important to the church in reconciling you with God to help you come to that realization that I'm created good, male or female, and I've got to embrace that. But they don't always have to undergo a surgical reversal of all that they've gone through. It may not be medically wise. By the same token, that same person, let's say it's a male who was representing as a woman and now it's too complicated to go through all of that. It doesn't mean that that male can go use the woman's restroom. In that case, because there's a reality that the church is responsible for upholding the truth, male and female. He's a male. So what the church would do, or what the pastor did in that case, was make arrangements that this person had access to a private restroom because the person did not feel comfortable going in the men's room. It wasn't suitable for them to go in the women's room. So those are the kinds of things that can be worked out on a pastoral basis, one-on-one. So it's important to understand that gender ideology, the ideology, is incompatible with the truth of the Catholic faith. And that's just true. You can read Amoris Laetitia, you can read Laudato Si, Pope Francis's writings. You can also look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where it talks about every person must acknowledge and accept his or her sexual identity. It's the clear teaching of the church what it means to be a human being. If you repudiate that, you are in contradiction with that. But again, the question of whether you're culpable for that, what your intent is, whether you're suffering from mental illness, those are the kinds of things that need to be worked out on a pastoral basis personally by a person or by a priest dealing with the individual. So I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Can I just add a quick something to that? I'm Anglican. I'll just be full on. I'm not Catholic, I'm Anglican. But giving thought to the question of whether a Christian can accept gender ideology, I think it causes cognitive dissonance, which is holding two opposing beliefs at the same time, and they don't go together. Because if you believe in God, if you believe in a creator, sovereign God who is all-powerful, you can't believe that people could accidentally be born in the wrong body. Believing in trans ideology requires you to believe one of three things about God. Either he's cruel, he did this on purpose, he put people in bodies that don't suit them and requires them to live at odds with themselves or be medicalized for life. That's cruel. He's incompetent. He can't prevent it from happening, and he can't heal it when it does happen. Or he just doesn't exist, which I think is the only intellectually honest position on God if you want to accept transgender ideology.
Which is just two more little points. So, which is why when you look at the actual writings by people who are promoting this, they are explicitly atheist. And again, I want to be careful. It doesn't mean that most people who are supporting this are also atheists. We can't make that judgment. Most people, in my experience, do not see automatically the conflict there. They're trying to be kind to people, and they haven't probed it. They don't understand the ramifications, et cetera. So I think that's important. So
This is just a follow-up. I said this. People have been saying this. God doesn't make mistakes, right? And how would you kind of address intersex individuals or people with kind of chromosomal issues?
Yeah, I'm going to say a quick thing, then I don't know, whoever else wants to say something. So actually that relates to the last question too. Some people say, but wait, you've got an adult who really, really, really feels like this is who they are. So did God make a mistake? And I think there we have to come back to the truth that all of us can suffer from all sorts of imperfections. God doesn't do evil. God doesn't create bad things, but we suffer the effects of original sin. And so those things don't mean that God's created it that way. If you have feelings that don't comport with reality, that's not God's perfect will for you. Why? Because God's a God of truth, and it's not loving either. So, and the same thing with intersex disorders or whatever. Things happen just in the natural course of things. You can be born with one arm or whatever. That's not God doing a bad thing for you, nor does it mean that that's God's new perfect design for the human being. It's just a natural consequence of sin, evil, natural evil, as the church calls it, just imperfection. So, yeah, living in a fallen world.
Thank you. This is directed at Maria, but Jeremy, please feel free to answer. What rights do we have as parents for notification to force contact of our children to transgender children? So the example was used that somebody's daughter went to a Girl Scout camp, and there was a trans girl, a boy there, and he did stay in another tent, but he was spewing trans rhetoric all week.
This is a hard one. You really need to find out ahead of time before you send your child to camp. What is the camp's policy on this? What is the camp's policy if a child comes and says, he's a biological boy, but he says he's a girl? Are they going to put him in with the girls? That's happening. I suspect more than it's not now, and you need to know that. I would not send my child to that camp. As far as the legality and the rights, I'm going to pass to Jeremy.
Yeah, this is one of those areas where there's no statutes that say one way or another. If the student did something while they were there, you would have the ability to file a lawsuit, and that's what's happened down in Virginia in schools where a male student raped a female student in the bathroom, so now there's litigation over that kind of stuff. But I don't think there's a right to advance notification per se, but it does violate the right to privacy, and so depending what jurisdiction you're in, wouldn't be Pennsylvania, but I think you would have a lawsuit for violating personal privacy, which there are many federal cases in the context of males and females, when we all know it's male and female. So the real question is when courts are going to be able to look at it and say, look, there is a defined right to privacy from members of the opposite sex, regardless of their gender identity. We're just not there yet.
Great, thank you. This question is for Aaron. How did God get through to you at last? Were you at a particular event with certain people, or was it a gradual understanding that God loves you?
That is a great question, and it's a little complicated. It started out when there was a conversion therapy ban introduced in Utah. And at the time, I was an atheist. I was volunteering for Planned Parenthood. I had been campaigning for a transgender candidate for Senate. I was very much in the camp of the far left. But when I got this letter about the conversion therapy from Equality Utah, which is the pro-equality group in Utah, and I got the letter because I had been a donor. And I read through it, and I thought, there's been a mistake here, because it sounded to me like they were trying to ban the therapy that helped me when I was a child. And so I tried to get in touch with the director of Equality Utah and confirm this, because I thought it makes no sense. And if I just explained to him that this ban is going to have harmful effects on children, then he would change it. And I tried to get in touch with him via Facebook, and he blocked me. So I decided to meet him in person at an event, a public event, and he had security take me away, and I started to realize something was very wrong. So I went and testified at the legislature about my experience and how important it was not to ban this kind of therapy. And there was a woman there who I grew up with, who was on TV all the time. She was the director of the Utah Eagle Forum, which is a family rights organization nationally, but it was very active in Utah. And I grew up with her being on TV and my mom cussing at her every time she appeared on TV. So she approached me and said, Erin, would you please come and share your story at our events? And I was like, I don't know. And I said, I need you to know I don't agree with you on anything but this. And she said, that's okay. We want to hear your story. And so I went to a couple events in Utah and shared my story, and I found that these people who I had thought were awful turned out to be very kind and loving, and that their agenda wasn't about hate, but they actually really seemed to genuinely care about children. So the Eagle Forum invited me to a national function in Washington, D.C., which is where I met Maria for the first time. And I told them again, I need you to know I don't agree with you on most things, but I'll come and talk, and you just need to know I'm an atheist, I'm pro-choice. I volunteer for Planned Parenthood, and they said, that's okay, come. And so I had been there for a while, and I was feeling love for the first time, just this overwhelming, unconditional love. They loved me even though they knew I was an atheist. They loved me even though I was pro-choice. They loved me even though I didn't agree with them on anything but the transgender issue. And after I presented, one of the women got up and said, Erin, I know that you don't believe in God, but you need to know He believes in you. And for the first time, I just felt this outpouring of love from Maria and the other people at the conference. And I had this thought that if they really knew me, they wouldn't want me there, and they wouldn't love me. Because at the time, I was making a living by doing pornography for Pornhub. And so I confessed to some of the women there who had invited me. And I said, I know you probably don't want me here, and you probably don't want to hear my story, because I am sinful, and I am unlovable, and this is what I have been doing. And they loved me. And they loved me. And I saw myself through their eyes, and I felt God's love in a way that I had never felt before. And I went home from that conference, and I deleted every video, and I prayed to God, and I said, Jesus, I'm yours. And it has been yes. Praise God. Praise God. And I just want to tell you, I know sometimes it feels hopeless, but if God can get me, He can get anyone.
Thank you so much, Erin. This is for Dr. Sodergren. It's kind of a long, so I'll read it. A friend who's in their mid-20s states that he feels that he is bisexual, therefore states he is gender non-binary. He says that he is much more attracted to women, but is somewhat attracted to men. How much of this might be typical, heterosexual presentation, and during the puberty years, isn't some same-sex attraction typical?
So this is a complicated question. And I read this question earlier, so I've thought about it a little bit. My first reaction is, this is kind of a confused young man who's still kind of searching for himself and trying to figure out who the heck he is. And you know, that part is typical in the sense that we all have to go through a process like that. And for some, it's more linear and you know, more simple unfolding. And for others, it takes all kinds of twists and turns, and you go through periods of confusion, and maybe I'm this and maybe I'm that, and I'm trying to figure out who I am and where I fit. I skipped over earlier, but there's a slide that I sometimes include in the presentation where I talk a little bit about the tasks of adolescence, which I think you can simplify to identity, community, and mission. These are three things that every adolescent, every young adult is trying to sort of figure out. Who am I? Where do I belong? And what's my purpose? And it seems like those, you can kind of get those questions or those issues, infer them from this question. Now, it is common nowadays, I wouldn't say typical in the sense of like normal development, but common nowadays for young people to question their sexual orientation and to question their gender identity. And that's reflected in some of the polling data and statistics that Mary presented, for instance, where you see higher rates of young people today identifying with one of the LGBT groups than it used to be even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, right? And so it just reflects there's a lot more searching going on, and I think it means that young people today have a much more, it's a more difficult process for them to answer those developmental tasks of identity, community, and mission because they're presented with all these different options, and it's almost sort of mandated that you have to sort of, you know, survey the buffet before you choose something for your entree, okay, to use a sort of a poor analogy. So it is typical nowadays that there's some experimentation, at least in thought, and sometimes actually in practice, trying on different types of relationships, different types of experiences to see sort of what fits the person. I think that's unfortunate. I think it, like I said, makes this whole process harder. But it's also important just to say that because I feel a certain way, a feeling or a desire doesn't define who you are at your core. And that's really, really important, right? Because the culture often tells us, I feel this way, therefore I am this way. So I go from feeling to sort of ontology. This is who I am at my core. And then that means I must embrace this and live it out if I'm going to be happy. Right? And that whole thing is a lie. It's just not true, right? So it's okay to explore, but the point is that my fundamental identity doesn't change. My fundamental identity is a son or daughter of God, even if I have feelings that are in conflict with that, okay? And so that's the alternative viewpoint that we would want to offer someone like this, is that, okay, so you have these different feelings and you're not quite sure where you fit, but at the end of the day, you're a beloved son of the Father. And that's the bedrock of who you are, no matter how you're feeling on a particular day or week or month.
I hadn't put this together before. I've heard that as well about identity, community, and mission. But it wasn't until you were just talking, I was thinking trans ideology takes all three of those captive. Your identity is either with the bad cis het people, or you're on the LGBTQ umbrella. Your community is either with the bigots and transphobes or with the nice LGBTQ community, and your mission is either to be an ally or to be a bigot and hateful person.
Can I just throw one thing in about sexual identification? One thing to remember with younger people, I know the question was about someone in his 20s, but younger people, it's complicated too because our culture has gotten rid of just normal same-sex friendship. Everything is sexualized. So it's one thing I hear from middle school teachers where they observe that, you know, girls tend to hang out with girls and boys hang out with boys, and then they start to get close to puberty and their feelings get confused because they're told if they love someone, which most of us love our best friends, well, that means that must be you're lesbian, you're gay, you're bisexual, or whatever. It becomes confused because there's no room that the culture has left for normal same-sex friendships. Everything gets sexualized. So particularly with young kids, it's really important to encourage them, don't put a label on yourself. First of all, we don't identify ourselves by our desires and feelings, but don't label yourself. Give yourself the freedom that comes with not labeling yourself to just figure out what you're feeling and grow and to deepen friendships first, just even before you get into relationships, because that's important anyway. So.
And I also just wanted to mention that a lot of these kids who are having confusion are on anti-anxiety or antidepressant medications. And those can actually circumvent the normal sexual development. Oftentimes it kind of kills the libido. And so a teenager who should be kind of growing up and into their own sexuality, oftentimes that's undermined by the medications that they're on. And so if all of their friends are developing, these crushes or sexual feelings and they're not, a lot of times they can confuse that as maybe I'm same-sex attracted because I really like my buddy, I really like my friend, but I'm not sexually attracted to the opposite sex. And so antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication can really, in some cases they're necessary, but in a lot of cases they can really do a lot of damage to that child's pubertal development.
Yeah, and I work with a lot of middle school and high school girls specifically, and that is one of my core messages, what Mary just said. Attraction does not equal sexual attraction, and that's what our culture is saying. And that's where you see, again, that relief come and that freedom for these women to just be themselves in the proper context of that statement, of course. So just thank you again to all of our speakers. The root of all this, and I love how that was summed up in the end, is that ultimately our deepest identity is that we are sons or daughters of God. And God assigned us our sonship or our daughterhood, and in heaven we will be male and female. And so continue to just, beyond anything else that we can say to those around us, is that you are loved because you are a son or daughter of God, period. Because that is our core identity. So with that, we are going to wrap up. Can we have one more round of applause, please, for all of our speakers?